I'd like to welcome you all to this meeting of the Healthy Planet Action Coalition with Chris Vivien from the group of experts on the scientific aspects of marine protection. And it's a great pleasure to have Chris join us to talk and share his great expertise on the governance of carbon dioxide removal in the ocean and related aspects. So Chris will speak to us for, I think, about 20 minutes and then open up a broad discussion with all participants. Chris, thank you.
Okay, so I've got two presentations, one a very short one to governance, which is just saying what the London Convention Protocol are doing currently in terms of looking at other techniques for governance. But first I'll kick off with a presentation about an ocean fertilization technique, which some colleagues on the NOAC group have been proposed recently, or not very recently perhaps. And I'll just explain why for at least part of the ocean that might not be a good idea. So that's how I'm going to do it. Hopefully it won't take too long. I'll just share my screen. Now then, where are we? Too many things on the screen at once, I think. Can't see it for some reason. What's going on? Show all windows. That's probably what I need to do. That would help. There's some that were hiding away. Yeah, okay. So I'll put it onto slideshow. So hopefully you can see my title slide there.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So I've titled it, "Well, it's not a good idea to fertilize ocean gyres." And this is particularly with respect to the climate arcs technique that Clive and who is it? Can't remember now. Amongst others have proposed. So the climate arcs concept, just in essence, the key parts of it, I'll just put up there on that slide for you to see. So they say photosynthetic growth is increasingly limited by lack of nutrients. Removal of ocean life by overfishing and whaling and other things has reduced natural nutrient levels over large ocean areas by loss of their excretion. Those nutrients still exist in deeper waters, but the warmer seas are slowing the rate of mixing. And finally, that the addition of appropriate levels of missing nutrients to the ocean surface could enable substantial recovery of ocean biomass. And if I move to the other slide, this just illustrates what they're proposing. You can't see it very clearly, but perhaps this is the rear end of a ship here, towing a large pipe that goes down to something like 300 meters, and then it comes back up towards the surface, and there is a sort of diffuser section at the end. The idea being that it picks up the water from the depth and brings it up close to the surface, and the diffuser section allows it to mix with the water near the surface, because if you bring up deep water and just let it come out, it's cold and dense and would sink. So the diffuser part is quite important in order to avoid the stuff just sinking straight away. So that's the climate arcs concept. So just a few things first. I just want to mention a little bit about ocean circulation. Now, many of you are familiar with the AMOC, but generally, winds, water density, and tides are what drives ocean currents in general. Coastal and seafloor features also influence them in terms of direction and speed and location. But ocean circulation in the ocean is basically in two main components: the AMOC, which many of you heard about, the global ocean conveyor, but also the wind-driven circulation as well. And the winds create surface currents by transferring their energy to the water by friction, and the wind-driven circulation is the most dynamic part of the current system. And the Earth's rotation results in the Coriolis effect that probably most of you have heard of, which means that it deviates currents in the northern hemisphere into the right, and also then opposite direction left in the southern hemisphere. And this force directs them deflects them, sorry, about 45 degrees from the wind direction initially. And at the equator, there is no deflection at all, because obviously there's a balance between the two hemispheres there. So just a quick picture there for that's the current system of the globe. Probably many of you are familiar with at least some of that, if not all of it. And you notice in the middle of these systems, there's these gyres. There's 5 in the globe, 2 in the Atlantic, 2 in the Pacific, and 1 in the Indian. Although there could be a sort of sub-gyre in some parts of the oceans as well. But the main ones, there's 5 which are recognised. And in fact, you can see them just clearly identified here. And they're a major feature of the ocean system. They move water in large circular patterns around the ocean basins. And they're an example of what's called geostrophic flow, type of movement that occurs when forces acting on the object are weak relative to the influence of the Earth's rotation, allowing the Coriolis deflection to be the main factor that determines the direction of motion. They're often said to be ocean deserts, but that is a somewhat misleading concept. They are generally not really a desert in the sense most people think of a desert, even though I think most people don't realize that deserts are not completely lifeless, of course. So geostrophic currents. The major currents of the world ocean, such as the Gulf Stream, the Kuroshio, the Agulhas Current, and so on, are examples of these geostrophic currents. And they're the surface currents caused by a variability in sea surface elevation. Due to difference in elevation, you get a horizontal pressure gradient, and consequently you get a current flowing from areas with higher elevation to areas with lower elevation. People don't realize that across the ocean, there's quite a height difference from one side of the ocean to the other. And in the northern hemisphere, as the gyre rotates clockwise, because the net movement of the Ekman transport, that I'll mention a bit later, it's 90 degrees to the right of the wind in the top 100 meters. In other words, towards the center of the gyre. So this transport piles water up towards the center of the gyre, and that then causes a flow around it, as you'll see in a little diagram on the next slide. And the sea level, so therefore, is higher in the center of the ocean basins. And there's a little diagram there, just shows you some of what's going on. And the pile of water inevitably has a tendency to try and flow downhill due to gravity. And as it tries to do that, it's deviated again by the Coriolis force. So you get this circular clockwise current around the center of the gyres. And same as the gyres, the geostrophic flow is clockwise in the northern hemisphere and counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. Now, just a diagram of an Ekman spiral. I won't try and go into great detail about it, but basically the top layer of the ocean gets deviated by the wind, as I've said, because of the Coriolis force. The next layer down gets deviated a bit more and a bit more. And this affects about the top 100 meters. But the net transport overall is at right angles to the wind direction over that total depth. Something that probably isn't that familiar to many people. Anyway, to move on to the ocean gyres in a bit more detail themselves and the system there. This, as I said before, they're not lifeless. I'd just like to take the Sargasso Sea in the North Atlantic gyre as an example. Many of you heard of the Sargasso Sea, of course. The Sargasso Sea Commission report that there's a link to at the end shows the importance of the Sargasso Sea. And despite the fact that it's claimed to be a lifeless area in the middle of a gyre, there's a lot going on. There's fisheries, there's all sorts of things. There's lots of human activities, and there's also a lot of actual benefit to various communities around it economically from that area. And so people always think the gyres have low productivity. However, despite being classed as oligotrophic, the Sargasso Sea has a surprisingly high net annual primary productivity that matches level found in some of the most productive regions in the ocean. There's been more about it in that report from the Sargasso Sea Commission, and it's linked at the end. It's due to a combination of factors. There's a lot of photosynthesis going on in the surface waters of the Sargasso Sea. It has a deep euphotic layer. It has a very different plankton and associated nitrogen fixation going on. Most of the production is recycled by bacteria. This is not the same as what happens in the surface layers of the ocean outside the gyres, where you have phytoplankton, zooplankton, and so on, and been mineralized, so-called microbial loop. So this is driven very differently to other areas of the ocean, but that ecosystem exists, and also I've looked at just a very quick search around, looking at what the other gyres might have. North Pacific gyres seems to have some similarities to Sargasso Sea from my quick look. However, the Southern Hemisphere gyres all seem to have pretty low productivity. South Pacific's the lowest of all, and it's obviously the one that's most remote from land. But they still have unique ecosystems that are adapted to these low nutrient conditions. And these current systems have been in place since, well, certainly since the Panama Isthmus closed off and the Atlantic was cut off from the Pacific, which I believe was somewhere around about 3 million years ago. So the current systems is what forms the gyres, and those gyres are what forms the ecosystems, the currents form the ecosystems effectively in those areas. And despite the fact that there's been this quite a good data that originally the oceans had something like double the biomass they do have currently, that biomass is not from the areas of the gyres. So the ocean gyres are maintained, as I was just saying, by their current systems and the stratification that limits exchange of nutrients and so on with the surrounding waters. These are unique ecosystems that don't need fertilization. Any such fertilization would lead to those ecosystems being massively changed to a state unlike any that existed previously in those areas. So in my view, any use of the climate arc concepts in the ocean gyre areas is liable to be harmful to those ecosystems. That's not to say the same would be applied elsewhere, but within the ocean gyres, which are the biggest areas, and I think some of the proponents of the climate arc concepts, I think, conceived of doing this in the ocean gyre areas. And at the end, and I can send you the actual slides so you can distribute, if you like, there's a list of all of the various references and things that I picked up the information from, including that report down the bottom there from La Folie et al., which is from the Sargasso Sea Commission. The Sargasso Sea is a remarkably rich area, despite the fact it's nominally an ocean desert. And the only thing I'd like to say finally on this little presentation is, if you're interested in ocean CDR, this recent paper by Rowling is well worth reading if you want to delve into the detail. And if you don't want to go into all the detail, I just encourage you to read the section that I've mentioned there towards the end, pages 12 to 13, which talks about debunking frequently encountered statements and arguments. It's a very good paper, and I would recommend it. And that's all I've got to say on that. Perhaps I can stop there, and we can talk about that, and then I can have the short presentation about governance whenever you're ready to do that. Okay, I'll stop the share.
Thanks very much, Chris. That's a good starting point. Let's open up a conversation about the issues that you've raised in that presentation, and I invite anyone who wishes to speak to raise their hand, and Mike McCracken is first. Mike.
Let's see. Hi, Chris. Very interesting. So can you give a perspective of what happened in the gyres back during the glacial period? So what is it like when things are colder, and what is the projection for what will happen in the gyres as we get warmer?
Well, certainly as the gyres get warmer, as with happening generally, stratification is becoming stronger, which is reducing any mixing with natural mixing with the layers underneath the gyres. Presumably the temperature in those waters is going to increase in those surface layers. But the thing of that Sargasso Sea as well, which you may have seen, the euphotic layer is rather deeper than general. It can be several hundred meters or more deep. It's part of the feature of the system, as it seems. So what will happen when it gets warmer? I'm not at all sure. I'm not an expert on that area, really. I know a bit about CDR and so on, but the gyres are not something I've ever had a lot to do with. And frankly, for the geostrophic currents and all that, I had to rack my brains from back my days of my university degree many years ago and look some stuff up just to make sure I remembered things correctly. So I wouldn't be too certain about what would happen, but I guess that the system, because it's based on bacteria, the main recycling is all bacterial. I assume that will speed up essentially if temperatures go up. That sort of reactions will generally speed up. What that'll mean for the ecosystem, I'm not at all certain. But of course, many of the creatures that are found in the Sargasso Sea are migrants. Things like tuna and things, they migrate there at certain times of year and out again. Sharks likewise. Of course, they may be affected where else they are in the ocean as well. So whether that'll reduce their appearances in the Sargasso Sea, I've no idea, because it depends on their main sort of feeding, breeding areas and the like, I guess.
So I thought that a lot of the flow once you get down sort of below the thermocline was sort of along isopycnals
If you get below
so,
the thermocline, then you're into the basically the density-driven system in the deep sea, like the North Atlantic deep water coming down from the Arctic, Antarctic deep water coming the other way, and you get these multiple layers, some going in opposite directions to each other. And there's about 4 or 5 main layers in the Atlantic, I think, if I remember rightly. But yeah, so those are basically density-driven system beneath the surface layer. That's right.
Thanks.
Chris, in saying that by fertilizing the gyres, you would affect a sensitive ecosystem. The situation is that those systems are already under massive stress from global warming, and also, I assume, from fishing. And so one of the purposes of the marine geoengineering techniques is to increase the overall nutrient level and increase biomass. And my impression is that that would be overall protective for marine life and also have cooling benefits for the planet. So the argument about disrupting a sensitive ecosystem seems to just be one factor. Like it may be that intervention would produce better overall results than not intervening. What do you think about that?
I think that probably you would need to treat the ocean gyre areas differently to the other areas. So it may be that a very modest addition might not be too harmful, because those systems are based on basically relatively low nutrient availability. If you put a load of extra nutrients in a system that's not used to it at all, and never has had, then I think you may perturb the ecosystem significantly, as well as doing the other things that you talked about. Of course, I accept that there could be some cooling benefits from blooming phytoplankton, and there may be some benefits for fisheries, but a lot of the fisheries benefits in the ocean gyres, at least the Sargasso Sea one, are from migratory fish coming through rather than fish populations resident in the areas, i.e. they're feeding or passing through as part of their migratory pathways. So I'm not sure that there are significant fisheries likely within the areas or likely to develop within the areas. I wouldn't have thought, but I don't know enough about that to be absolutely certain. But I think whatever you are thinking about, you would, I think, need to approach ocean gyre areas differently to how you would do it in other parts of the ocean, because they are a very different type of ecosystems. So I think you would need a appropriate sort of experimentation, pilot studies to study it in order to judge what is and is not appropriate.
Yeah, and in any case, that sort of study is limited under the London Protocol, and we'll come back to discuss that when we look at your governance paper. So we'll have another 10 minutes or so on this, and hear from Clive and then Peter. Clive.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. What areas of the ocean do you think would be more suitable to climate arcs, upwelling nutrients?
Well, basically, at least in principle, the areas outside the Gyres.
So
Clearly,
any area outside the Gyres
well,
that's
not necessarily any area, bearing in mind, of course, there are some areas that have sensitivities for other reasons, either through legal things or through sensitive environments. And also bearing in mind things like the BBNJ Treaty, which is being agreed. It's not yet in force, of course. That will put additional onus on anything happening within the ocean on the high seas. And the Gyres are all on the high seas, of course, by definition, or pretty much anyway. There's one or two odd islands around that have some EZ around them, but they're relatively small compared to the Gyre areas. So I think, yeah, it's the most productive areas of the ocean are those that always have been productive, and that is essentially upwelling areas, continental shelves, continental slopes. That's where all of the fisheries have been concentrated, apart from those migratory ones like tuna that move around across the oceans a lot. And those areas are, in my view, are those areas where the productivity always has been, and those are the areas that have declined over the last 300 years since we became much more efficient at going out and catching fish, particularly with the advent, once we moved particularly from sail to steam power. That was a sort of a multiplier, significant multiplier of our efficiency, if you want to put it that way. Other people might use a different word than efficiency, perhaps, for our destructive effect on the fisheries. Certainly, if you look, I mean, I worked for an organisation in Northwest England many years ago that had been established in 1892 because of the concerns about the incoming steam trawlers being too efficient, and they wanted to try and preserve the fisheries in the inshore waters. So this is a long-standing issue that goes back, as some people have already said in the past, something like 300 years is the period over which we've really made an impact on fisheries.
Thanks, Chris.
so it's hard to say what area. So the Gyres,
I think Gyres just need to be treated differently, is what I would say. You couldn't just go and do the same things you do elsewhere, not without careful experimentation first.
Yeah.
To see,
okay. Thank you.
Because you might need to do it quite differently. I would suspect you would do it at a lower level and not try and do anything like as much as you would in the other areas.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Peter.
Yeah. Let's see. A few very simple questions. When we talk about the gyre, is that pretty much equivalent to people saying whole basin in the ocean?
No, it's the areas inside those currents that I showed the maps of. So the currents around the outside are not part of the gyre. So in the North Atlantic, you've got the Gulf Stream obviously going up one side across the North Atlantic, and then you've got the other currents, Canary currents, and come down the other side. Those are not part of the gyres. They're effectively the boundaries to the gyres.
So whole basin would be the gyre plus the boundary.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. And then I wasn't paying enough attention, but I think you said it in one sentence. The problem with putting fertilization for increasing the iron or whatever it is in the gyre, what was the nit of that? What's the core of that?
Well, for one thing, because the remineralization, the activity is mostly bacterial driven in those areas. It's not driven by phytoplankton and zooplankton. So I don't know what effect iron would have on bacteria. It will have some effect, I presume, but it's not going to be the same as affecting phytoplankton, that's for sure. So how effective using iron would be, I don't know. I mean, the technique of climate arcs that I was particularly talking about obviously is bringing up water from deep, which has the whole mix of nutrients in it: nitrogen, phosphorus, iron, and other minor nutrients. Of course, it does have the downside of also bringing up additional CO2, although by taking it from something like 300 meters, you're minimizing that rather than taking it much deeper when you would bring up more CO2.
Right. And the bacteria, would that be mostly cyanobacteria?
I can't remember for sure. It certainly would be involved them, I think. Whether that's the main ones, I'm not sure.
Great. Okay. And the last quick question. Migratory fish, presumably they would, as they're migrating through, they'll eat whatever there is to eat, right? So it's not like they're fasting while they're migrating.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess some of them are fasting, some of them would be feeding whatever's there. Certainly the sargasso itself, the sargassum, sorry, has a particular ecosystem. It has a whole series of fish and other creatures that live within it. In fact, some of them are endemic. They're quite unique to that ecosystem. So that little ecosystem around the floating weed is something that is pretty unique. I don't know if some of those fish get predated by other fish that come along, because the fish in the weed are pretty small, most of them, I believe, maybe only 10 or 20 centimeters in size, perhaps. And bigger fish might predate them, I suppose.
Right. Okay, good. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Robert, Chris.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, you've touched on this in answering other questions, but I'm a bit intrigued about the areas that are included in the gyres that would be inappropriate for additional fertilization, and the areas that are not in the gyres that would be appropriate for it. So whilst you've been talking, I've just found another map of these gyres, and the impression I have from this is that almost the entire ocean, apart from the littoral regions and the continental shelves, almost the entire open ocean is in a gyre.
Apart from the currents, so the Gulf Stream, for example, is not in the jar.
Correct.
And the same goes in the other currents. So the currents I showed earlier on those maps, they are the boundaries of the gyres. They're not part of the gyres because they're carrying their material away from the gyres effectively. They're going round it, but some of them are shooting off in different directions, like the North Atlantic drift comes off the Gulf Stream over into Europe, for example. And there are other current systems that do something similar as well.
No, but I mean I accept that. But having said that, there's still the kind of the area that is in the middle of the of those currents still represents, just sort of eyeballing the map, it still represents like 80% of the ocean.
Oh yeah, it's probably a very large percentage indeed. I would agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So in a way, that kind of simplifies things to a degree, isn't it? Because it means that if you were thinking about fertilizing the ocean, you have got there's a big chunk of the ocean that you don't need to worry about. You can just focus on what remains on that 10 or 20% that is.
And where you go also depends, of course, on what nutrients things you're trying to fertilize with, because you, particularly for things like iron, the areas that are deficient in iron already, which we know about, which is the Southern Ocean, the Eastern Equatorial Pacific, and the North Pacific, the subarctic North Pacific. Those areas have plenty of other nitrogen, phosphorus type nutrients, but they don't have iron, which is what limits their productivity. That's why they're low in chlorophyll. So those areas, if it's iron you're talking about, those areas was where you would have the biggest effect. Now, for other things, for the other substances, it varies a bit, because obviously the other one I haven't mentioned is silica, because of course diatoms need silica as well as the other nutrients as well. But that will vary a bit around the ocean depending on the circumstances. Close to coast, you get more nutrients, obviously. Further away, the amount of nutrients coming from the land, at least, is obviously decreased significantly.
Okay, fine, thank you.
Now, rather than continue questions on this presentation, Chris has a second presentation on governance, which I think opens up some of the issues that of particular interest to discuss. So I'll invite Chris now to make his second presentation, and then we'll continue with discussion on both presentations. Thank you, Chris.
Okay. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, right. So this is just going to be a very quick, short run through about basically where we've got to with London Protocol in terms of looking at regulating other CDR techniques or other techniques of marine geoengineering as they define it. So I'll just talk about the amendments to the 2013 amendments that probably most of you are familiar with, so I won't dwell on that unless you particularly want me to say something about that. I'll briefly say what GESAMP is, and then I'll talk about what the GESAMP working group's advice to the London Protocol parties was. The London Protocol parties considered it, and they made some decisions back in October last year. So in terms of the 2013 amendments, there's a lot of text here, but basically you're already aware, I think most of you, of the amendment that came in to regulate marine geoengineering in general, but at the moment only specifically addresses ocean fertilization. And that's really all you need to know about that. We needn't go into all the detail here unless you want to come back to it, okay? So GESAMP. So the GESAMP is the joint group of experts on the scientific aspects of marine environmental protection. You left environmental out, Robert, but never mind. It's an interagency body of the United Nations, originally established in 1969. And we currently have 10 UN agencies as members or sponsors of the body. And we are looking to try and include an 11th one, which is the UNFCCC, which is something under discussion, I believe, at the moment. So that's who the body is. And the people on the body are appointed independently. They're not appointed by governments or institutions. They're basically invited by the sponsoring agencies to become members, and they don't represent their governments or their institutions. They're there as their individual experts. So that's what GESAMP is. So the Working Group 41 that I'm a co-chair of, back in April last year, provided some advice to the London Convention and Protocol scientific groups, suggesting that the following techniques were those highest priority techniques for them to consider for listing in the new Annex 4 of the Protocol. And there's those 7 techniques there that we put forward as potentially those that might be of interest to the parties. Not saying they definitely would be, but they were just ones that we considered would be relevant to consider. And the convention parties looked at these and decided, after going through a correspondence group and a meeting, eventually recommended the 4 techniques that are in the red box, which is macroalgae cultivation and sinking, but also includes crop waste, alkalinity addition, marine cloud brightening, and increasing ocean reflectivity mainly through particles. And that one really, at the moment, the only issue there is the silica microspheres that have been suggested by some people. And you'll notice there you've got 2 ocean CDR techniques and 2 albedo techniques. And then at the governing bodies meeting back last October, they agreed with those 4 techniques that should be further considered. Now, in this case, they then extended the work of the scientific groups to consider looking at those techniques, but also established a group that will be considering the legal issues about whether or not they would include them. So we have 2 groups running in parallel, the legal group and the scientific groups, who have been working in the intersessional period since last October. And there was a further discussion at the scientific groups meeting this April this year as well. And this will all come back to the group, to the main bodies meeting in October this year for further consideration of the way forward. There's nothing been decided as yet, and certainly I wouldn't expect any firm decision at the next meeting. It's probably more going to be a planning meeting for perhaps coming up with something definitive the year after, I would guess. That'd be pure guesswork, but I think that's likely based on my experience with how fast these bodies tend to move. You've got to remember, international bodies move very slowly, generally. But you have many parties who have to be got on board, and the convention and protocol parties almost always work by consensus. There's never been a vote in all my time that I was involved in it, and I was involved with these bodies for 27 years. There was never a vote at any time at all. We always work for a consensus. Anyway, that's what's happening in terms of those 4 techniques going forward for consideration for regulation to be added to that list that at the moment only has ocean fertilization. And there we go. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Chris. Now we can continue the discussion on both the presentations, and we'll hear first from Anton.
Thank you, Chris. That was excellent. I'm curious, given your insight and your experience into both organizations and the processes they use to make decisions, and your assessment that it's always done by consensus and therefore those things take a long time. Do you anticipate a pace change or a change in the way that these groups will make decisions in the future? And I'm talking, a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, as climate change inevitably only gets worse and solutions become of more interest. Do you anticipate any of these bodies being more reactive or responsive, given they're going to be experiencing everything we're all going to be experiencing too? And if so, do you think that's a good thing, or do you have trepidation about that?
I think it is possible that they could speed up to some extent in response to a perceived need. At the same time, it isn't always very easy to make decisions on things quickly, particularly if any major players have some resistance to it. So, for example, interestingly, the United States is not a member of the London Protocol, although it is a member of the London Convention. And in the negotiations for the Protocol Amendment, of which they were not a party, the United States was very vociferous about basically wanting to hold back and not push ahead and all that sort of thing. But that was back in 2013. The picture is somewhat different now, because the US delegates now discussing these issues are much keener to be involved and want to push things along a bit. I suspect that's in reaction to the fact that there's many startups and institutions and others coming forward with projects who want to do things in the ocean, and the US have realized they need to have a system to get a grip on it. So I think that has certainly, in regard to the US, has certainly, I think, had a marked effect on their sort of perceptions as the way forward, in terms of they need to move much faster than perhaps they would have done back in 2013, some 10 years ago. Because at that time, ocean fertilization was really the only sort of one around that people were very familiar with. And the reason they were familiar with it in 2013, of course, was because of the Haida-Gwaii experiment in 2012. That obviously got a lot of attention. So I think that of itself did stimulate part of the agenda. And the further activities now that are ongoing, I think it is also providing some stimulation. So I suspect that could be a factor in how fast people can move. At the same time, by their nature, these bodies usually have annual meetings. The scientific group meets in the middle of the year, and the governing bodies meets in sort of autumn time generally. But they can have ad hoc meetings if really required, and that has happened in the past. If they need to move forward on a particular issue and make something happen quicker, they can have an ad hoc meeting to discuss a specific issue and then bring it to the governing bodies for a decision. So there are ways and means to speed things up to some extent, but again, it's not always easy. And I think my experience recently is there is one country in particular that has been a member of the awkward squad, and it's not the US, who has been quite resistant to a lot of things happening, and that is Saudi Arabia. Interestingly, China was very unsure about this when we first started discussing a potential amendment. But after a lot of encouragement and providing information and so on, I think they realized that it was something that needed to be done. So they've moved quite a bit as well. Russia, interestingly, had not really been engaged in this subject. But China has been, and some of the other big countries have as well.
Okay, I'll go ahead. Very interesting. Amazing what you can cover in 5 minutes, Chris. Talk about drinking from a fire hose. So, question is, the governance needs to have goals. And I would assume, tell me if this is correct, that the goal of the governance work that you're engaging in is basically reducing human interference into the climate and ocean system. Is that roughly correct?
Well, the remit of the London Convention and Protocol is fundamentally protection of the marine environment. That's the basic remit, full stop. You can look at the detail in terms of what it says in those instruments, but that's the basic thing. I think we all realize that the Convention and Protocol can only regulate these things to a certain extent. What's within their remit. Clearly, their remit doesn't extend to a whole load of social, economic, and other aspects. The economic, there may be some aspects of that, but not all. Things like human rights and so on. So, but at the time they started on this process, it just felt they needed to do something rather than just let things happen outside any regulatory system. So in my conception is, if at some point we have an instrument that might regulate geoengineering or whatever we wanted to call it at the time, then I would envisage a partnership between that body and the Convention and Protocol in terms of any overall regulation, with the wider body perhaps under the UNFCCC, but that perhaps doesn't seem very likely at the moment, providing the more overall and dealing with the bigger, wider issues in terms of the climate and so on. And the other thing is just worth mentioning is the GESAMP working group, which I'm co-chair of. We're developing an integrated assessment framework which is designed to take into account all the natural science and social science issues. And the working group is about 45% social scientists now, so it's not dominated by natural scientists at all. So we're looking to try and develop something that will encompass all of the issues. Now, that would not be something that the Convention and Protocol could buy into completely, because some of it's outside their remit, but we hope it will be a useful instrument for permitting bodies or funders perhaps, or others, to use to be able to screen proposals for techniques to go into the ocean to enable an assessment that would cover the whole gamut of different issues that any of these techniques would raise.
There's a lot there. The question then is, a lot of us, or if there are a number of us, working to create a focus on humanity surviving, humanity flourishing, in addition to reducing our interference into the climate system. A lot of us have a feeling that we've sort of gone over the edge and be smart to restore historically safe climate. If we were to succeed to get the UNFCCC interested in a historically safe climate for humanity, which would be below 300 parts per million likely, how would that reflect in the work of your governance bodies? So,
well, as I said,
no interference to let's make it safe for humanity again. That's a big change. It's unlikely, but if we did.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think whatever international body that might appear that would regulate the whole climate sort of type techniques overall, I think would need to, with regard to the ocean at least, would need to partner up with the London Convention and Protocol, because clearly a body that deals with the atmosphere doesn't have the expertise to deal with the ocean specifically in terms of specific regulation, whereas I think a partnership has the possibilities if it's appropriately developed. So I would envisage that's how any sort of system should work. And it may be, of course, there will be other bodies for other techniques that might need to have partnerships with an international body as well. I don't know what exactly, but I mean, I wouldn't rule any of them out. It's something, I think it's such a wide issue that I think it's got to involve different people. The other big one at the moment, I mentioned briefly earlier, the BBNJ treaty, that sets down quite a big issue for dealing with biodiversity, and it sets quite a lot of targets for doing things like EAAs and requiring EIAs for things. There's also issues there for other things, of course, things like genomic related stuff, which is not perhaps directly relevant here. But there's about 4 main issues under that treaty. EIA is one. That's probably going to be where there'll be significant interactions between London Convention and Protocol and that body when it's established, and also other bodies too. So there's going to be quite a bit of a 3-ring circus, I think, because obviously people at the CBD are interested as well in that area. There's also things like the regional conventions, OSPAR, Helsinki, other ones around the world, Caribbean, for example. So there's going to be a whole range of people who would need to be involved in any of these sort of discussions, I think.
Right. Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Apologies, I was on mute when I tried to introduce you earlier. And Robert, Chris.
Yeah, just a little quickie, Chris. You mentioned that there were 6 techniques that were considered, and 2 didn't make the cut. What was it about I missed. I blinked, and I missed which the 2 were that didn't make it.
Okay, hold on a second. I'll just remind myself. There was actually 7 recommended. Actually, the ones that didn't make it were
what about them that actually made them fail?
Well, it was a question of just priorities, I think, in terms of fundamentally the perceived scale of activity going on in those areas. So the ones that seem to be very active, a lot of people getting involved, were seen to be more important and urgent of needing looking at than those where there was relatively little activity. So that there was actually 3 that were they're not failed because they could come up again later. But the 3 that were put on the back burner, as it were fertilization for fish stock enhancement, which actually is only essentially be a variation on ocean fertilization. It wouldn't be a completely new technique, really. Then there's mineralization of CO2 in rocks under the seabed, which again is a bit of a variation on the existing controls that the Convention and Protocol have in terms of putting CO2 down into old sort of oil and gas reservoirs and the like, CCS in other words, carbon capture and storage. And then the last one was extraction of CO2 from seawater, so direct ocean capture, I think it's sometimes called. That was the 3 that didn't get included at the moment. I think it was just a question of what's perceived as more important to tackle at the moment. Not that the others had no value, but just that they were not perceived as important currently.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Robert. Clive.
Yes. The marine cloud brightening one, Chris, is that just for sea salt? Because some of us are talking about iron-3 chloride from ship flues to deplete methane, but that would also make a haze, and you'll know of the ARM paper, the radiative forcing is just as much from haze as from brightening clouds. Would it be no? You can't. It's got to be sea salt, or would that be considered?
Not necessarily. I mean, the other thing with that one is the one where there is a question, I think, in some people's mind about whether the Convention and Protocol's bodies remit would cover them, because clearly they're putting things into the atmosphere. Now, some of that stuff will come down again onto the sea surface, of course. And there is a precedent of a sort in that back in the 60s, 70s, there was something called marine incineration going on, where in the US and in Europe, there were these special ships that incinerated hazardous waste that was too nasty to deal with on land at the time. They were either very toxic things, like with lots of chlorine in, or they were very, very smelly ones with full of sulfurous compounds that, like the stuff that you put in gas to make it detectable, but worse than that. So that's why they used it. So that was regulated because it was clear most of the waste they started out with were the chlorinated ones. And you could see that when they had the plumes from the incinerators, the plumes would usually touch down on the sea surface and therefore could deposit materials into the sea. And as I think we talked about at NOAC, there's quite an interest from some people now in the sea surface microlayer and the effects of that from pollution and other things. And so that will be perhaps the angle. But whether that would necessarily carry the day, I have no idea. the legal people have got to make some decisions about that. So I don't know if that one would even go through at all at the moment. It might do, but it might not.
What, the incineration?
No, the marine clad brightening.
Yeah, with iron 3 chloride. Okay.
Well, with anything, probably.
With anything. When you say go through, that you mean they might say
they might decide that they shouldn't regulate it because it's not really within their remit.
Oh,
they might not. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a legal issue fundamentally.
Yeah. Can I just say, Franz and I were just earlier today talking about incinerating plastic, collecting plastic and incinerating, adding iron 3 chloride to it. But
I don't think incinerating plastic would be a good idea. It gives off horrible fumes.
Yeah, but if you can have combustion catalysts and make it hot, then everything burns. You get rid of everything. It's just CO2.
The marine incinerations, they were being incinerated about 1200 degrees centigrade, and they still had pollutants and things causing problems from that. So unless you're going to suggest you're using something like a plasma torch, then I think you could still have problems.
Okay. Need to talk to Franz. Thank you.
Now, Chris, I'd like to explain, trying to put my finger on my concern about this process. I had a look at the homepage of the London Convention, and its title is Convention on the Prevention of Marine Pollution by Dumping of Wastes and Other Matter. And the concern that I have is about intent, and that is that marine geoengineering methods are not dumping of waste. They are intended to provide benefit to the marine system, whereas dumping of waste is just intended to get rid of rubbish that's of no use. And so it just seems to me that marine geoengineering should have been, from the start, ruled out of scope by the London Convention and London.
Well, you have to refer to the text of the Convention and Protocol, because there is an article there, a general one, that the contracting parties shall individually and collectively protect and preserve the marine environment from all sources of pollution and take effective measures to prevent, reduce, and where practical, eliminate pollution, control caused by dumping, and so on. And there's also a general obligation to take a precautionary approach to environmental protection, and so on. So there is a general obligation which extends, and the point is the amendment to the protocol has extended that. So you should, the title effectively is out of date. So you shouldn't hang anything on the title.
All right, but it's still the case, I think, that the title implies a highly pejorative attitude towards marine geoengineering, because
but Robert, marine geoengineering can still cause pollution if it's done wrongly, surely.
Yeah, but the pollution is incidental. Or the potential
doesn't matter.
For, and well, okay. So, but it's still. I would have thought that if they were, there's an impression of a highly politicized process here, where groups who are ideologically hostile to marine geoengineering have, I suppose, exploited the protocol.
I'll have to correct you there, Robert. Those groups had very little influence except around the margins. This was pushed by countries, not by NGOs at all. And there was a general concern from the countries represented both in Europe, North America, and Asia, and elsewhere. They were the ones who were pushing this forward. The NGOs made quite a bit of noise and so on, but they were no means instrumental. So I think your perception of the Convention and Protocol, I think you wrote something about this a long time ago, I seem to remember, and that was completely mistaken in my view, because I've been in those bodies for 27 years, so I know what they're like.
Yeah, okay. Well, I suppose that I still feel that there is this pejorative context that suggests that, for example, ocean iron fertilization can be classified as the dumping of waste. And
no, it doesn't. The amendment is crafted out in a different way, because it's taken from there is a part of the text of the Convention and Protocol that talks about dumping doesn't include placement of matter for a purpose other than the mere disposal thereof, provided such placement is not contrary to the aims of the protocol. And that's where this amendment came out of. Yeah, I mean, the point is there are activities which are dumping, but nevertheless are economically beneficial and regarded as necessary. Dumping of dredge material, which keeps ports open and keeps international trade going, which is something that happens, and that potentially can cause pollution if it's done wrongly, as could marine geoengineering. So I don't see any fundamental difference, frankly. The fact it may have the whole point of dumping of dredge material is to enable an economic activity that's a benefit. So it's not fundamentally different to what you're talking about, I don't think. But I think the other thing is you're looking in from outside, not aware of how these bodies work, and making assumptions, I think, that are not actually accurate. People look at some of the things like the Ocean Fertilization Assessment Framework and think, oh, that looks terribly complicated. It's nothing very complicated. It's just a risk assessment, basically. And it's the same sort of thing that hundreds of ports around the globe use all the time in regulating and managing their activities of dumping of dredge material. It's a question of familiarity. People unfamiliar with these things look at it and think it's all complicated. The other thing to remember, that document, the Ocean Fertilization Assessment Framework, is a guidance document. Guidance has a specific meaning. It is not mandatory. Some people look at these things and assume they're mandatory. They're not. It's there for the interpretation by the state bodies that regulate the activity. That's the other thing you need to remember. This is regulated ultimately by the states. It's not regulated by the Convention and Protocol. The Convention and Protocol provide the overall structures and guidance, but the states, such as Australia or the US or the UK or whoever, are the ones who actually regulate.
So given that as you say, that the title of the convention is out of date, given that it seems that the regulation of marine geoengineering has become a significant part of its work, I wonder if the London Convention would give thought to changing its name.
Possibly, I guess. I mean, I think there are certainly some people, and I'd probably include myself in it, would turn it into a general marine environmental protection convention, not necessarily doing with dumping. The other thing to remember is at the time that we moved forward with the amendments and the work before that, there was no other body around that was in a position to do anything. And it's still the case, effectively. There's no other appropriate body. Certainly, I think the parties to the Convention and Protocol would regard them as being much more suitable than, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which has no legal powers anyway.
Thanks, Chris. I will go on to Jim Baird.
Chris, I have had a stroke, so I can't speak very well. So I wonder if Chris will respond to some questions that I've put into the chat.
Just a moment. Yeah, I'll put the link to the rolling thing in the chat. Yeah, I'll do that.
I've already put the rolling.
Oh, it's already there. Robert's done it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think Jim's questions must have just gone to you personally. I don't see them.
Hang on, maybe it's further up the screen. Oh, I haven't seen one from Jim at all.
Okay, Jim, you mustn't have hit send on your questions. Please hit send and share them with us.
Yeah, you got to hit the little arrow thing to make it go.
It's at 146 on the chat.
But who did you send it to?
Did you send it to everyone or just to me or what?
Jim, I suggest perhaps we'll let you work that out and maybe come back to you. Is that okay?
Okay.
So Mike McCracken.
Thanks. Chris, I have two questions. One relates to governance and one to the science. So on the governance, I was sort of the atmospheric rep to SCORE for 9 years. Is SCORE involved in how GESAMP works?
Not specifically. I think we have some links with SCORE, and SCORE did make an intervention back in 2008 about the ocean fertilization issue. They issued a statement about it, the concern about it, because this was at a time when Russ George was going to do his dumping initially off the Galapagos and then off the Azores. And they made a particular intervention then, but I would say it hasn't been any active intervention at the moment, but we do have links to some people who are connected there. We also have some links to a couple of other bodies like SOLAS, the Surface Ocean Lower Atmosphere Study, and there's some work being started there hopefully quite soon, and also that'll be a study that involves CDR MIP as well.
I mean, so SCORE is like ICSU or whatever ICSU is now, but I mean, it was sort of formed by national academies and stuff. And so what you're saying is GESAMP is the UN governmental part or something.
Mike, could you tell us what SCORE is?
Scientific Committee on Ocean Research.
Oceanic Research, which was established in I think 1957 as under the International Geophysical Year kind of thing to coordinate all ocean activities undertaken by the nations. But its structure comes up from the academies of science of the nations of the world that are involved, and so it's non-governmental. It's sort of the scientific part, and often they're partners with the governmental part. So IPCC, for example, is a combination of the scientific part that comes up plus the governmental part. So I was just curious how that related, but okay. The question I had actually goes back to the question on gyres. So over the years, there have been, over long history, there have been a lot of volcanic eruptions, and that deposits a lot of volcanic ash onto the ocean. Are there any indications of what that did in the gyres? I mean, supposedly the gyres have presumably survived that over all this time, getting.
It obviously depends where.
Does that mean they're pretty robust?
Well, the other thing is, of course, it depends where the volcano is and the general wind direction from it, whether they would necessarily get into a gyre. Now, some of them could. Now, when it depends. I'm trying to think. There was an eruption in Iceland some years ago, which did deposit some volcanic ash immediately to the south of Iceland, but I don't think that got into the North Atlantic gyre. It was basically to the north of the Gulf Stream extension, for example, that particular case. Other ones, I mean, I'm not aware of one in recent years that has erupted into an ocean gyre area. There have been some that have erupted, obviously some big ones in recent decades. And interestingly enough, I heard something recently that suggested that Mount Toba, that was the biggest eruption in historical times, is starting to rumble. And that one was far bigger than Krakatoa. And that last erupted in about 17 something or other, I think. A long time ago anyway, a couple 100 years. That is in Indonesia. So that material would presumably be carried west, and I suppose that one might deposit stuff in the Indian Ocean gyre, and maybe if it carried on far enough in the Atlantic.
Yeah, I'm just curious if there's natural examples that give some sense of how robust the gyre system is.
I'm not aware of a specific example, certainly not in the last decades, that's particularly dumped stuff in the gyres.
Thanks.
What about Hawaii, or is it Maui, or these Hawaiian islands? There's
well, they're not explosive eruptions that put ash out, Clive. It's general lava that just flows out. They're not explosive.
Okay.
You've got to have a pretty explosive one to put ash out, as opposed to just oozing lava.
Okay. All right.
I think Ron's next, if that's okay, Robert.
Oh, thank you, Robert. Yes, Chris, thank you. This is very interesting. Your depth of knowledge here is quite extraordinary. I'm interested to know if, for example, this is in reference to the bunker fuel issue. When a regulation, when the IMO, I guess the International Marine IMO organization, maritime organization, or does a regulation that significantly increases warming, particularly in certain parts of the ocean, which the studies now indicate about 1 watts per meter square over those particular marine channels, with about 0.1 for the entire globe, increase in warming, which would, I presume, have probably a damaging effect on marine life, where that significant warming occurs. So it's an interesting question, because here is a situation where the status quo ante was a result of human, emissions of fossil fuels that was helping marine life, not deliberately, but at least in terms of cooling. I mean, that the sulfur may be another issue. Well, we know it was harmful to human health, but it conflicts. And so what I'm getting at is, would it be, possible for your organization to take up issues of warming and cooling and possible, and of course I'm thinking of, methods to reduce that warming that could include aerosol emissions from those ships, or relaxing the bunker fuel, at least temporarily, until other more benign aerosols like seawater, as Stephen has suggested, could replace that. So it's just that it's kind of a hypothetical question, but you have a conflict between two agencies that appear to be working in opposite directions.
Well, the Marine Environmental Protection Committee of IMO, which is the body that came up with those regulations, ultimately comes under a quite separate treaty, of course, the MARPOL Treaty of 1973-78, and certainly the London Convention on Protocol could not regulate anything to do with emissions from ships. That's very strictly an issue for MARPOL. That doesn't mean that we could not discuss it, because we have had discussions on issues that go across what we call boundary issues between ourselves and MEPC. And the examples that we've had there in the past were things like what we called spoilt cargoes was one. You may not be aware, but sometimes cargoes of various types get spoiled before, say, seawater gets into it or something, like a grain or something like that. And basically ports won't accept them coming in. They might have fungus growing on them or whoever or whatever. So they actually want to dump them at sea. So we had discussions about those in terms of how that should be handled and so on. So there is a sort of precedent for some discussion between the bodies about issues that go across the boundary. But certainly the Convention Protocol could raise issues with MEPC if they so wished, that aren't strictly within their remit, but within their interest in it from the angle, as you mentioned, of climate warming. But effectively, for that to happen, you're going to have to get a country, or even an NGO, actually, I suppose, to put a paper into the meeting to raise the issue to get it discussed. It won't just happen of its own accord. Someone's got to actually stick their hand up, as it were, and say, hey, a minute, what about this? What should we say about it? It's something I suppose an NGO might be interested in. I mean, they're obviously interested in, quite a few of them interested in global warming issues. And we have about 3 or 4 NGOs, I think, in the Convention and Protocol. So we've got people like Greenpeace, World Wildlife Fund, ACOPS, and those are probably the 3 main ones I can think of off the top of my head. The environmental ones, anyway. We have some other NGO types, but they're different. They're not environmental ones. So yeah, that's the only way you get it discussed. Someone's got to come in with a paper and say, or raise their hand at a meeting and say, this is an issue we want to discuss.
Would an open letter from a large group of distinguished experts such as yourself or others have? I guess you would have a conflict of interest, but other people Would that be
Well, I
another
mean,
possible
one
avenue?
could always, if one could always write a letter to the Secretariat of the Convention and Protocol and say, this is an issue that's come up. You know, are you going to do anything about it, or however you want to phrase it? Whether that would of itself be enough, I don't know, or to be honest. It might, but it would certainly be much easier for someone who's within the meeting to get it raised. That would be the best option, I would have thought. So it's certainly something I have actually asked someone in IMO about. Were they really aware of the consequences of doing this at the time the regulations were framed? I suspect, and it goes back quite a long way, this is not a very recent thing. The planning for this regulation is like a decade or so old, when perhaps climate would have been less in the front of people's mind. I suspect it probably wasn't. I suspect the main thing was, I think the estimated, was it 80,000 people dying a year because of it or something?
Something like that.
Something of that order. That order anyway.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Now, Jim has provided a comment in the chat, which is essentially a statement about thermodynamic geoengineering. I'm just wondering, should I read that out for you, Jim?
I can.
Or we can allow everyone to read Jim's statement and see if Chris has any comment on it.
Yeah.
Maybe Chris, you could just repeat the question and.
Yeah. Okay. I'll say it. It says the IPCC is big on ranges of probability. With thermodynamic geoengineering, GESAMP claimed, based on a paper by Kwiatkowski, that implemented at a large scale, that thermodynamic geoengineering would be temporary, regionally heterogeneous, and present the type of termination risks usually associated with solar geoengineering approaches. I don't think that's correct. We talked about OTEC, not solar. And the paper modeled an upwelling of the top 1,000 meters of the ocean at a range of 60 centimeters per second. Yeah, the reference in the paper and in the text, and I looked at it this afternoon because I'd had an email from Jim, doesn't refer to solar geoengineering at all. It refers to OTEC, ocean thermal energy conversion, which is where the upwelling of 1,000 meters comes from. And it was a reference to that. It could well turn out that is something of minor relevance. I don't know. We were not damning thermodynamic geoengineering. It was just using references to the Kwiatkowski paper and also referring earlier in that section it was in, where there was a section about ocean thermal energy conversion, and there were papers in there that mentioned that particular termination risk. That's where it came from. It's if you look at it, it's paper by, I think, Fujita, who was in the beginning of that section. So we were just basing that information on published information from others. But as with all scientific research, things can move on. I'm
looking at page 76 of your study, number 98, and that's exactly what it says. It says heat pipe OTEC, also called thermodynamic.
Oh, yeah, so it does. Yeah, sorry, I was mistaken there. No, termination risk. Yeah, that came from Kwiatkowski. That was that's what they came up with. That's what the quote is. And then the text after that about OTEC heat pipes and so on, that's information derives from earlier in that section when they're talking about OTEC. So we were just referring to existing information. That may well not be right. I would accept. I don't claim that is definitely
I'm putting
the
up
case.
My hands. I'm putting up my hand for you guys to issue a retraction.
Well, I don't think we need to retract anything. The papers that are based that on are the ones that may need to make an retraction. We just refer to another document, a couple of papers. That in science, things change and can be modified. You know, as time goes by, we learn more, and we can then disprove things that have come up. We don't have to issue retractions about everything. That every scientific advance doesn't have to issue a retraction about earlier papers.
All right, let's move on. Thanks very much, Jim, for raising that. And just a couple of quick things in the chat. Peter Fikowski has asked, what was the third NGO you mentioned? Greenpeace, WWF, and the third one?
It's called ACOPS. It's Advisory Committee on Pollution of the Sea. It's a UK-based organisation.
And I see that Clive has provided a link to the ACOPS.
Oh yeah, Clive's
page.
got a link to it there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Clive.
Thank you.
ACOPS changed its name slightly some years ago. It used to be the Advisory Committee on Oil Pollution of the Sea, and then decided to expand its remit to just pollution of the sea in general.
Right. And Ron asked a general question about the marine geoengineering statement. Now, I assume by that Ron means the 2013 amendment to the London Protocol, but I've put in a broad link to the London Convention and also the IMO page on marine geoengineering, which provides an opportunity to delve into the quite considerable literature around this topic. But Chris may have other suggestions on that.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the comment from Ron. You said there's Ron put a
I was just asking for the link. I was just asking for the link.
Oh, I see. Oh, right. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There was a comment from someone else, by the way, about the Tonga eruption, which I had forgotten about, which did put a lot of stuff in. How far that went, I don't know. A lot of it went pretty much straight up and down, I think. But certainly there was a lot of stuff put in the atmosphere initially. It was an incredibly explosive eruption.
Well,
anyway,
if we have time after Herb's question, we may be able to discuss Mount Pinatubo as well. But Herb.
Thanks, Chris. It strikes me that you have a unusual, maybe even unique sort of set of skills and experience and perspective. On the one hand, with your quarter of a decade plus work with the convention and associated entities, and then participating in groups like ours and being very familiar with, the broader goals of using the ocean in a benign but critical way to draw down CO2 and cool the earth, and whatever combinations are necessary to deal with the crisis that we face. So I guess in that context, and maybe this is sort of following on with the questions that others have asked, maybe a little more indirectly, but I mean, do you see the present institutional structure, of which presumably the convention is the key component of that regulatory structure, as sort of fit for purpose in order to be able to accommodate, if not promote, the kinds of trial testing and ultimate deployment that may be necessary? Or if not, are there particular either narrow or broad recommendations that or suggestions you might have for what changes need to be made in that structure and system?
Well, I think I go back partly to what I said earlier, in that clearly the convention and protocol, and by the way, people should realize that the protocol is a standalone instrument. It's not a conventional protocol to a convention that you find in generally. It'll eventually completely replace the convention in itself. I can't remember the legal issues about why they went that way, but anyway, that's what it is. I can't. So the remit of the convention, it's the protocol that's the one that regulates marine geoengineering, not the convention. I think at the moment its remit is fundamentally to do with marine environmental protection, and as I alluded earlier, if we're going to cover all of the other issues around it, then I think we will need some other body to partner up with. That's not to say some of the issues, so for example, economic issues are something that is taken into consideration. So if someone wants to dump dredge material at sea, they might argue about whether they should dump it 3 miles off the coast, 10 miles off the coast, or whatever. Economic issues are part of the discussion about what you do in a particular circumstances. So economics is already effectively involved in decisions that are made under the convention and protocol. But what isn't covered is things like human rights and a lot of the social science type issues that have been discussed in recent years. Those ones are clearly outside. But the other one that's also clearly outside, which is where I see an international body being needed, is to set the, as it were, the overall agenda for how we, if we're dealing with climate intervention techniques generally, not just in the sea, but globally, atmosphere, land, a lot, who's going to set the agenda and say, you know, what's appropriate, what isn't, how do we account for it, monitoring, reporting, verification, and all those other issues. Now, clearly, within the ocean regime, the Convention and Protocol could probably deal with a narrow issue of what happens in there in terms of monitoring, reporting, and verification, but they're certainly not going to deal with the other ones. And by the way, the other thing that I've noticed is nearly everyone who talks about monitoring, reporting, and verifications is only talking about carbon credits. There's a lot more to MRV than carbon credits. And what people sometimes don't realize, if they don't get their MRV right in the first place for the environmental and other issues, they won't get a permit and they won't get any carbon credits. So I think there needs to be a lot more attention paid to MRV about the techniques themselves and their impacts, because that comes before you get your carbon credits. So I think it's complex at the moment. It could be that someone might come up with a brand new idea and come up with a new concept for somebody that's going to be take a lead in this. I think, although people raise the UNFCCC as a possibility, most people I've spoken to don't really regard it as realistic, because it is a very cumbersome instrument. There are 100 and, I don't know, 90 odd parties or something. Getting agreement there is far worse and slower than it would be under the Convention and Protocol. So we probably need something else, but who knows what. Some people have promoted the CBD, but as I said earlier, unless they, without any legal powers, they're not really in a position to have to manage such a process.
We know Sir David King recently, as many of you may have seen, proposed the creation of a World Climate Crisis Organization. I think that's what he called it. I'm not sure that he provided much in the way of details, but that probably could play the sort of role you're talking about.
I got the impression that was more of not exactly an advisory body, a bit more than that, but it didn't seem to be a regulatory body, I don't think. But as you say, there wasn't perhaps enough detail there to be sure exactly what it would do. Of course, it could change into something else, perhaps.
Well, I just hope that, and I think we all do, that there are people somewhere, even if they're doing it well hidden, that are thinking through these institutional changes that are necessary, so that they don't continue to be, or potentially be, the kind of barrier that I think a lot of us assume they may be to action.
Yeah, I think the problem there, Herb, is that we've still got this problem, which has been batted around the various groups like this one and NOAC and so on, of that the basic politicians and everyone else are not on board for climate intervention in any form, basically, or very little anyway. Tinkering around the edges mostly, and even things like the US Inflation Reduction Act. I've been reading recently that the vast majority of things there seem to be going to the oil companies to stick carbon dioxide in the ground, which is not exactly going to get us a long way forward. And what some of the oil companies have blatantly said, this is just to enable them to continue their business.
Yes. What can you say?
But so I think until you can get the politicians to say that we need to do something about the climate, that's when they'll then decide to do something in terms of regulation. Trying to do something about the regulation in advance of that, I think, is incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
Chris, I'd like to go back to you mentioned the Haida Gwaii experiment in 2012. Russ George fertilizing in the North Pacific Ocean of British Columbia with the intent of increasing salmon yields, and it's been an immensely controversial activity. And I would just be interested in, you commented that it was quite significant in leading governments to introduce the marine geoengineering amendments to the London Protocol, and yet I suppose the the view from some of the supporters of Russ George has been that there was a lot of distortion in the political debate around that activity, and that's why it created the perceptions of a significant chilling of field research on ocean iron fertilization. What's your thoughts on those issues?
I think it probably did have a chilling effect, yes. You're right, it's controversial, and setting aside the political side that I don't probably know so much about anyway, but there's certainly controversy on the scientific side in terms of what happened exactly and what the results were. There are people who very much support what Russ George claims, and there are others who don't. So where the truth lies there, I'm not at all sure. We do know that there have been good examples of volcanic eruptions depositing stuff in that part of the world. The Kasatoshi volcano that erupted back in the early 2000s, I think, and seemed to produce quite a large number of one of the types of pink salmon. I can't remember which variety now. So it's unclear to me for sure whether that had that effect or not. I'm not exactly agnostic, but I really don't know where the truth lies. But I think it's the way that they went about it that caused the problem, frankly. If they tried to do something, I think one of the complications, if I remember rightly, was that the Haida Gwaii claimed to have had no treaty with Canada, so they could basically do what they wanted to within their own jurisdiction, or words to that effect, I think. Something like that anyway. But on the other hand, for what I remember, they did pretty much go outside the EZ, and certainly I don't think anyone would recognise they had any jurisdiction on the high seas, or very close. They were very close to it if they weren't outside it. I'm not sure. They certainly went something like 200 miles offshore, if I remember rightly. A precise position I'm not certain of. So yeah, it's my perception primarily that I think the Haida Gwaii had an effect, but I think it's probably, if you ask other delegates who were there, I think they probably agree that that had an influence. But it's certainly my perception.
Thank you. Peter.
Yeah, Chris, I love your comment that until we get governments interested in climate intervention, we're not going to get anywhere.
Well, not within international regulation of climate intervention as a whole is what I was referring to. The overall picture to manage the whole thing.
Yeah. And it certainly constrains things a lot. In California, we got past a resolution last month that says that that California is committed to, I don't have the exact wording, but it's committed to restoring the climate for future generations. And we're working to get that similar resolution introduced into the House and Senate. In your view, would that start tipping the scale so governments have permission to think about intervention?
Possibly. It does remind me, actually, interestingly, Wales has something called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Which is very forward-thinking. But interestingly, the UK and the rest of the UK, their governments have not picked up on that one, but the Welsh have. And it's certainly been, and it's also been, I think, quite an influential instrument in Wales in influencing how other legislation was put forward and managed. So you might want to look into that.
I will definitely. That's great. And an add-on question for anyone here. My local representative, who I've known for many years, said, well, she'd be interested in introducing it when we got a couple or a few environmental organizations involved. Are there any, is anyone on this call part of it, such an organization that might want to endorse a resolution that says that we're committed to restoring the climate, restoring a historically safe climate for future generations? And anyone you recommend?
If you keep it as general as that, you might well find some people. The only thing is that what some people might draw that you want to do from that is where it might be the sticking point. Off the top of my head, I know. Yeah, I know, but it's just that people can say, yeah, well, that's what you say now, but what then how are you going to do with it? I know people like Greenpeace will be very skeptical. Well, they might not be skeptical of just the bare resolution you've mentioned. They could probably support that. Most NGOs probably could, but it's where it goes from there that will be the suspicion might prevent them from signing up to it because they're worried about where it would go. There are probably relatively few environmental NGOs who are very keen on other than what they call nature-based solutions, which I think is a misnomer anyway, because most nature-based solutions involve a lot of technology in practice.
Now we've reached the end of our time, so I'd like to extend a very deep thanks, Chris, for sharing your expertise, your knowledge with us about these really important issues, and it's wonderful for us to be able to get the insights from your engagement with the governance processes. So thank you very much.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris.
I can send you the PDF of the slides if you want to have that.
Oh yes, please.
So the meeting has been recorded and will be published on the Healthy Planet Action Coalition website. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining our call today, and we'll conclude at that point.